لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله ما لنا رب سواه. So my name is Iltefat Hamzavi, and Basil gave this to me as a Muslim physician over so many years. Giving me something that looks like a hand grenade is not exactly what I was hoping to start this meeting off, but as long as it's not clicking, we're so good. So I know there's been a long couple of days or a couple hours, and you're medical students, so you're sitting in even more lectures as part of your faith, as part of your professionalism. And so thanks for taking some time to talk to me. I am a dermatologist, and I help run a practice. That's an old biography, but alhamdulillah, we have around 40 providers now in our group. I also help direct the Institute for Investigator-Initiated Research at Henry Ford. We have 2 NIH grants with Dr. Mee's group, and also as very active in the boards of those disease states. But what I'm going to talk to you today is about your level of professionalism, but also your service to your community. You are the cream of the crop of our community, and many of you are going to be asked to be great physicians, but also community leaders who will have to build institutions, serve institutions that's way outside your comfort zone. And ISPU is something that we helped start in Metro Detroit many years ago, actually 20 years ago, and it's now one of the preeminent think tanks that actually discusses research on American Muslims. Anybody hear of ISPU before? Some of you have heard about it. Okay. Anybody see the JAMA article on suicide among the American Muslim community? That entire data set came from ISPU's American poll. So ISPU tries to stay in the background, and it is the basis by which data can be used by our community. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about ISPU and how it came up, and then just talk about activism. So we kind of defined a problem. We wanted to talk about what ISPU was, and hopefully this will mirror here. Okay. And then I will talk a little about the impact of ISPU, also the strategy and looking ahead. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because a lot of the ideas behind ISPU can be the basis of your company that you might want to start up, your research lab, your first clinic, your service to the VA, your service to government sectors, whatever you want to do, but aligning people and taking on big challenges is something I think all of you can do. So Islamophobia, and many of you know this industry, it was funded to make your lives miserable, but also it was funded because of just the normal human bias. We always feel better when somebody is worse than us. And we also want to explain things that are happening in society, and we want to displace that anger to a few individuals. That happens in medicine when a patient's screaming at you and they want to get into the clinic and they're in pain, but they're screaming at the reception staff. It's going to happen when you have people who will assign you responsibilities to see more patients because they're under pressure from their budget. It will happen with society when they blame you for pharmaceutical costs, even though you're only 8 to 15% of overall cost of healthcare. The Islamophobia industry was it's still a $205 million industry. Imagine how much money that is every single year against the 1%, 1.5% of Americans who are Muslim. And that was the industry that we were trying to deal with. And so at the time, and it still is better, but it's still a challenge, 90% of the coverage was negative. In fact, cancer and cocaine had more positive coverage than Islam up until 2015, 2016. And so we wanted to try to take on misinformation bias. And I grew up here in Metro Detroit. In 2001, my oldest son was about 2 years old. We just had our second one. I just moved back from Canada. I did a fellowship in Vancouver. And there was a statement going on throughout the media that 85% of the mosques in Metro Detroit, not in the United States, but in Metro Detroit, were terrorist-leaning. And those types of data sets, misinformation, was a challenge. Now in medicine it's the same thing. We come from evidence. If you see it, somebody else sees it, third person sees it, and you can reproduce it, that's truth. Well, if you wanted to make a statement and you have no evidence behind it, well, you can't go too far in society. Now, you can make some claims, you can even run an insurrection, but at some point you have to justify what you're saying with data. And one of the things about American Muslims, we didn't have anybody who was delivering data on our communities. We also could not go overseas to find good examples, and we had to look at examples in the United States. And so we had to deal with issues like religious-based bullying. 42% of the kids were bullied because of their faith. 1 out of 4 bullies were their teachers. we could not realize our full potential. And the fact that so many of you are still in this room and so many of you are at elite institutions, are coming from elite institutions, that's, I guess, the promise of what many parents in 2001 were worried about. Could our kids accomplish their full potential, whatever domain that was, and could they redefine what full potential is? Obviously, there's so many Muslim kids who are doing work in government, in nonprofit sectors, in engineering, in advanced mathematics, but we also have our traditional professions of medicine and engineering where we're still excelling. Well, I guess in many ways you didn't need ISP to do that, but that was the goal. We also have significant poverty in our communities, which we didn't want to talk about. We had the imaging of Muslim communities, a woman in hijab, a man wearing a beard, traditional representation of Muslims, those were always negative. And then the reality is that we're in a significant portion of the key essential workers and infrastructure in this country. So academic research is reliable. Many of you have worked in a lab, many of you worked in hopefully social research or survey-based research, outcomes research. That's tough work and it's vetted by lots of people, and people go to these meetings all over the world just to make sure that the data is reliable. But it's got limited reach. How many articles make it to 1 million views on TikTok? Not many. General research organizations such as Pew, who study the American Muslim community, are out there. They're reliable, but they have limited competencies, especially in the early 2000s, even now. How many people would allow a non-Muslim to walk into their Sunday Islamic school or their full-time Islamic school or the shura meeting, the board meetings of their masjids? Advocacy organizations such as CARE and MPAC do some wonderful work for our communities, but they're not viewed as reliable from non-Muslim sources or even within our community because they'll have an agenda. Their agenda is to make us look good and fight against people who want to attack our communities. And then ISPU, our hope was to be reliable and objective. We want to have a significant reach, and we want to be culturally competent. And so we wanted to be a place where Muslims are thriving and equal. And mashallah, you guys are representing that this weekend. It provides objective research and education, and it provides research so that ultimately we can support well-informed dialogue and decision-making. The fact that you didn't know ISPU, but you did know about the work on the JAMA Psychiatry article, that's kind of what ISPU wants to be. We aspire, and I'm not the board anymore, but we aspired, and now the group aspires to be the infrastructure. Most people don't know what the NIH is. Most people do not know what NIAMS is. Most people do not know what the CDC is. But the people in the world who do that work, who advocate for that work, do know where the core information comes from. And that's what ISPU aspired to. This is the expected outcome. Kids running in the masjid, people talking about Muslim heroes that are authentic and look like them. So what's the impact? If you type in American Muslim poll, ISPU's data is always number 1 or 2. If you look for data on American Muslims on Wikipedia, on the US government websites and media, it's ISPU. And the poll is probably the dominant source of research. Every year we do an annual poll. Nowadays, organizations, governmental as well as nonprofits, as for-profit organizations will buy money, will pay for the poll question to come up because the poll has come out over the past 6-7 years. And these are just kind of common comments from people throughout the country. Policymakers use ISPU's data, so the data about American Muslim bullying occurred from the poll. The poll compares evangelicals, Catholics, Jewish individuals, and Muslims to each other. And so when somebody asks a question, what are Muslim views on abortion, we have that data. When somebody asks a question, how many Muslim children have attempted or thought about suicide, we can ask that question because the data set's been consistent. But it also takes a tremendous amount of SRS research that we use out of a group in North Carolina to make sure that we normalize a small group against a very large group to get good questions answered. The group that actually advocates the most violence based upon religious principles is not Muslims. I'm not going to say the group, but you can probably guess who it is because you have your own biases, and you can guess any one of those. But the data will say what the data is going to say. The number of times people have had challenges with building a masjid, we have that data. And so we compare that to different areas. So that's why when President Biden was running, he actually referenced ISPU. And regularly in the administration. ISPU and the teams that provide information to them are sought out by the administration at the federal level, state, and county level. Congressman Andy Levin fortunately lost his primary, but he was very, very supportive of the work. But there are multiple senators, Debbie Stabenow, and as well as our other senator, Gary Peters, spoke about the ISP's work. These are some of the institutions that use it. At NPR and CBS, if you have a data point on American Muslim communities, if it does not match up with the ISPU poll, they go through a methodologic survey to figure out how you got that answer. And if it doesn't make sense, they don't accept it. So nobody's walking around saying 85% of Muslim masjids are terrorist-leaning. People are asking questions, what can we do better to support the Muslim community? Because we do have challenges. We do have challenges that might be disproportionate to other communities. But the media goes through that. We have 700 media citations a day, 2 per day. More than 1 billion people saw an ISPU-based survey in 2019. It's probably about 1.4, 1.5 now, this past year. Even Metro Times in Detroit, 15% of our physicians in the Metro Detroit area, Michigan, are actually Muslim. And so imagine what would happen to our COVID responses if we didn't have Muslims. So it goes back to that vision where we're thriving. We're not just here to survive. We are actually an essential element of the American fabric. We're also a resource for imams and leaders when we talk about marriage issues, retention, how Muslims are passing away, issues related to COVID support. A lot of the imams are using ISPU data, and this is Imam Halim from Cedar Rapids. Zainab Ansari at the Taysir Seminary also talked about ISP's work. So there's these groups that are called change agents. You'll find them in medicine. They're the people who actually make a shift in policy. For example, is a mammogram going to be covered? Will colonoscopy be covered? Will autoimmune dermatologic diseases be covered? An area that I work in. Within dermatology, we're always viewed as the Botox cosmetic doctors, and the reality is 90% of our diseases have significant quality of life elements, and some of the diseases we have some of the highest suicide rates in the field of medicine among younger people. And so there's change agents that also affect US policy. And I didn't understand how medicine was impacted until I started to watch how change agents. There's media people, there's people who control resources within Congress, the staffers, there's people within federal agencies, there's individuals within large corporations that will often look at that, and 2,700 of them are trained by ISPU data. And so all of these subgroups, all of these institutions, CARE, MLFA, Emgage, Yaqeen, TED, Georgetown, they use ISPU data. And that's kind of some of the, of the 411 interviews, ISPU is considered the most trusted resource for data. Safer schools is another area that they worked on. And then increased civic engagement. Back in 2016, Muslims were voting at the lowest rate of any faith-based group. What do you think happens every election cycle? In every country in the world where Muslims are a minority, the attacks against Muslims increase during the election cycle. When was the last time people were attacked for wearing hijab and applying to medical residencies? 2016. Guess who had to make a statement about that? AMMSA and other groups had to stand up and talk about that. The chief executive of Henry Ford Hospital, Nancy Splittling, made a statement about that. Well, those statements about the Muslim ban came out during the 2015 year 2015 for the 2016 cycle. So one of the things that ISPU did was, if Muslims vote at a higher rate, could it improve the situation? So nobody really knew what the rates were of Muslim voting, and they did numerous studies looking at that. And at the time, I was still the chair of the board, and that data really informed what I wanted to do next in my nonprofit activism, which was to increase Muslim voting. Muslim voting was around 73% of Muslims were registered to vote. It's the lowest base registration of any faith group. The Jewish community is around 98, 99%. Catholic communities, upper 90th percentile. Evangelicals, upper 90th percentile. We're in the bottom quarter of that. In the past 4 to 5 years, Emgage, with the support of CARE, Impact, and many other groups have increased that. And now, when elections happen where there's significant Muslim presence, you can actually have a say in that election. Doesn't mean you can always get what you want, but people think twice about attacking Muslims. In the last election, groups that sometimes have antithetical views of Muslims threw $7 million into some elections in Michigan. Part of the reason why they did that is because the Muslim vote is significantly increasing. So sometimes the attacks against us always also reflect some of the strengths are developing. So I encourage you to vote, but that whole process was a multi-year process, almost 18 years in the making. We started in 2002. We have 2 offices in Washington and Dearborn. We have, actually, there's 14 staff members, 50 plus affiliated academic members. This is a part I want to talk to you about, and that is, how do you serve on boards? How many of you are working with an organization like AMMSA or a nonprofit group or some student organization in your group? Okay. How many of you have elections? Okay. And how many of you have served as officers of the groups that you're part of? Okay. So you're understanding the structure of how human beings get things done. Nonprofits, student groups are critical. When I was a medical student, I went to school here at University of Michigan for undergrad in medical school. My God, it was a pressure cooker. Is it still a pressure cooker? Intense place. My happiest day was the day I left. But it's nice to be back in Rackham. I'm having some PTSD moments here. But it was a great institution. It pushed you very hard, but it was a tough place. Well, a lot of times you want to study more, and you don't want to spend as much time doing the nonprofit work or the student groups. But decisions are made in human organizations or groups of people. And the number of patients you will see, whether or not you have time off, the support staff, the medications you have access to, the ability to do certain procedures, those are based upon how you navigate these group dynamics. And if you can master adaptive immunity, innate immunity, but you can't talk to your chairman or the chief medical officer, you might enjoy C5 complement, but you're not going to enjoy a complement of supporters for the agenda you have. So build those skills up. And there's a couple of elements of any organization: time, treasure, and talent. You're medical students, you're poor. You are so poor. But that's going to change in a couple of years. But you're going to have to manage that wealth the best you can. You'll also have to learn how to put time in. And you have to be very strategic with the time that you put in. You don't have a lot of time. Inshallah, many of you will be having families, or you already have families. It's going to be non-stop. Your life will just never slow down. You'll have to be very strategic about your time, but you got to figure out what you're going to get out of it. And those soft skills you got to figure out. And then the skills of talent. Yes, you have the scientific skills, but you must remember you are not a pure scientist. You are the interface of society and science. And if you ever forget that, your patients will remind you, your staff will remind you, your peer groups will remind you. The pharmaceutical drug that costs almost 20% of our overall healthcare budget will remind you. And so understand that any board has 3 components: nominations, who's going to serve on that board; development, who's going to raise the money; finance, how you're going to spend that money. And when I was a student, I don't know if that's happening now, nobody taught me how these organizations worked. ISPU taught me this. And I didn't get into ISPU or any of these groups because I wanted to search for this. I just wanted my kids to grow up and be in a safe environment. I wanted them to sit in an auditorium like this and enjoy themselves. I wanted the kids in my community at Crescent Academy and Canton, MCWS, and my community I grew up in, IGD and Unity, to have a place to do that. Governance, how you run yourself collectively, is critical. And you have to find the best practices in medicine. And many of you are already doing that. But the Student Senate, running groups like AMMSA and starting things up like that, that's governance. And then when you get into high-level governance, it gets very boring. You know, calls to order, minutes, talking about the finances, budgets you don't even understand. This is like $35 million. Like, I have no idea what I'm doing here. Watch the people and how they resolve conflict. Watch how they make decisions, because you'll be in that room in the next few years. And you're like, you know, when I was a medical student, I should have spent a little time. I got onto this commission and I didn't, you know, spend attention, and I was watching my videos. I was trying to do my, what are those questions you guys do? Quizlets? Anki, or Quizlets, or all those things you guys are doing all the time. I mean, at least, like, you know, I would check my phone or look at TikTok. Actually, I'm looking at TikTok nowadays, and my students are actually doing Quizlets. They're working harder than I am. ISPU ended up getting the award from the National Nonprofit Center for Nonprofit Advancement at Washington, D.C. for the best governed board. Not for Muslim communities, but actually nationally. One of the things I know you guys can do is that you can build something for Muslims, by Muslims, for all. You're Americans very much as you are Muslims, and you must serve the societies you work in, but have a level of excellence, because mashallah, all of you are the best of our society. This is the team at ISP. One of the best things that we ever did was to make sure that we had representation for women. When we started our nonprofit communities, it was exclusively men. We left the board with mostly all female staff, and these are some of the best people in their field. Myra Nagaz headed up one of the Women's Health Initiatives. A $150 million fund came to ISPU. Dalia Magah is one of the most well-known Muslims on the face of the planet. Nadia Ahmed, a CPA with a focus on nonprofit management, advises major nonprofits on how to manage their finances. Kat Copland, who is also head of communications. Michelle Gale, director of development. Petra Al-Sufi, who's on the bottom left, leads outreach. But these are the people who are very good in their field, and they didn't want to work with Muslim organizations because they felt the quality of Muslim organizations was lower. One of the things we try to do at ISPU is whatever we can do, we want to do best in class. The other thing about ISPU is the funding is mixed. It's from the Muslim community as well as from the nonprofit foundation community. Our staff is mixed. How can you possibly have objective data on American Muslims if the only people doing the data is Muslims? And they're not going to be the wealthy uncles and aunties who actually funded many parts of your masjids. You can't have them do the research, because at the end of the day, if I fund the research, I also do the research, guess where the bias will come from? So our strategy at ISPU is very strategic: discover, educate, and then equip. And so again, there's 50 plus leading scholars. We have a diverse group of people. We didn't have billions of dollars to do research on American Muslim communities. We didn't have an NIH type budget. So what we did was that we said, okay, let's establish the top scholars in the field. A lot of times $40, $50, $100,000 is a lot of money for them. We'll fund them for that particular project. And then we'll slowly build up our in-house staff, which is the American Muslim poll. That will be supplemented, and then we get invited to some of the bigger meetings, or the staff gets invited to some of the top meetings, because we know more about American Muslims, our sphere of influence. We also are well governed and well run. And then we bring in people from NYU, Kumar Rao, one of the top attorneys in that area, Carrie Schenkman, Alok Chakravarti. These are all individuals who actually filed the amicus brief for the Muslim ban. A lot of the data that came to the Supreme Court came from these individuals. And because they were so respected in their field, they could take the ISPU data and talk about how religiously motivated violence resulted in convictions at a rate that was 7 to 10 times higher than the general population for Muslims. If a Muslim kid gets picked up for having pot, which they shouldn't do, but that means that their mom and dad should slap them upside their head, they get thrown in jail because they had pot in front of the masjid. That happened numerous times in Dearborn. 3 kids in North Carolina put in jail for 20 years because they were texting WhatsApp, doing things that they shouldn't be doing, but to put them in jail for 20 years, that's the type of data that came up, and it just showed the Supreme Court that there were fundamental flaws in the way Muslims were treated when it came to the religion, not talking about in all elements of the court cases. But again, by working with scholars like this, we leveraged our dollars as well as support. One of the things I'd like to talk about a little bit, in the early years of Miss Marvel, the comic book, ISPU's data, actually before Dalia even joined us, and then after Dalia joined us, we provided some initial information to the comic book organizations for that. We also have, Dalia's been on Trevor Noah. Trevor Noah actually attended ISNA a couple of years ago. Part of the reason why he came is because Dalia went there, and we asked him to come to ISNA. We were on the board that year, and we asked him to come on board at a very expensive cost, and he came. But I'm not sure if you ever had the chance to watch that particular interaction on YouTube, but Dalia does one of the best explanations of why women wear hijab in Islam. The desire to privatize your sexuality, agency of your sexuality, something that allowed people to kind of discuss that role. And he was joking, but it was serious. And it was one of the more popular shows he had that year. We multiply our reach by educating people. There's many physicians and just people who are not physicians and coming from different sectors. They come to Washington, D.C. and Dearborn to kind of learn about how to use ISPU data. We've educated law enforcement. I remember a Florida police officer who went to the ISPU training at the board impact session. He actually had a video of him. And a year ago, he had approached a Muslim woman and pulled her over. She was going like 90 miles an hour, so just because you're hijab doesn't mean you can speed. Pulled her over, and then he asked her to remove her hijab because he was concerned about a weapon. When he went through the training, and this was a partnership with CARE, and talked about how Muslim women perceive law enforcement, it was one of those things you can rarely do. And that is, when somebody does something wrong to you, something our faith teaches us is to provide them insight, reflect. And to have a police officer from Florida come up, who I'm sure did not vote for President Biden, state that I viewed her as a human being and that was a mistake, and he wanted to apologize to her and have that comprehension. That switch is what ISP has been trying to do along with many other groups for many years. And those are just some of the areas. The K through 12 teachers who heard that 25% of the bullying was occurring from teachers. Those are things where that child, I'm sure you heard a couple years ago in Texas, who made a watch and he was thrown out of school. Those are things that they became aware of. That's that reflection that comes from data. So the theory of change of ISPU is that if you provide research-backed recommendations to change agents, then these stakeholders will act on those recommendations to bring about positive change. Theory of change is something that you should learn how to use in any organization. It's the big thing you want to change. You should look at a theory of change for your own life. Why did you take on this tremendous challenge? You already come from probably prosperous families now. And some of those of you who did not will enter a prosperous phase of your life. But there's got to be something more, purpose and meaning. Well, what is the thing that you want to change? And theory of change is a whole set of classes that you probably have never heard about, you'll never hear about in medical school, that ultimately tells you how do you shift areas. And so when we do social marketing, we ultimately give our data to nonprofits that are interested in the space. They vet the data, but that data gets amplified because ISP does not have the budget to take over a massive TikTok or search engine optimization. We give that information to others and they optimize it for us. And again, these are some of the medical Muslim media professionals. MashaAllah, nowadays we have so many Muslim media professionals that it's increasing by the day. They have their own small organization. We present to them every year and they can go back and challenge these agencies when they come up with data that's not objectionable. So Chicago Tribune has been there numerous years. Here are some of the values. As you go through your life and as you pick up organizations, you've got to define the values of the organization, but you also have to know your own values. ISU is based on collaboration. We don't care if other people get the credit as long as the data is well vetted and we can vouch for it. Action. We want to see results and we will track the impact of our investments over time. Rigor. We are not going to put bad stuff out there. We will not put weak data out there. And if it makes Muslims look bad, so be it. And if it makes an administration that Muslims support look bad, so be it. Responsiveness, we will adjust our foci based on what the community needs. The community of 2022 is very different than what the communities of 2001 was. Our vision is, again, for an American society where Muslims are vibrant and excellence. ISP has received numerous awards, but receiving the award for the best governed nonprofit was one of the best awards they ever received, partly because they're so well run, and that was the excellence we wanted to do. We co-create, we partner, we speak multiple languages, we have dialogue, and we engage with potential allies. A lot of ISP's work isn't just producing the work, it's actually marketing it. You will see with the drugs that you might develop or the patients that you see, much of your time is spent on the advancement of that knowledge, not the creation of that knowledge. And ISPU is an example of that. Looking ahead, we have the American Muslim poll is coming out next week, and they just did the Illinois Civic Coalition's poll last year to talk about the impact of Muslims in the Chicago area. The highest density of Muslims in the United States is in Illinois. India is having some challenges, and some of the American Muslims who are of Indian descent are using some ISP processes, and we're also working with other groups that want to have foreign and domestic impact. That's not what we do. Here's some slides about federal legislation from Emgage. Emgage is the civic engagement arm of the American Muslim community, or one of them. But if you don't know this process, you should know that. Who's the biggest payer for healthcare right now? Who's your boss?
Is it government?
It's the government. Medicare, Medicaid. So if you never want to do anything with the American Muslim community, which is obviously probably not the case, or you never want to do policy for medicine, which may be the case, realize that if you don't watch this process, laws will come out like HIPAA, like some of the requirements for MIPS and MAPS to require your documentation that you don't always want. So you should understand that process, both as a Muslim, as an American, as well as a physician. And this is the process by which ISPU provides information, but Emgage tries to advance legislation. And so, this is Emgage's focus, which is to address issues that affect our communities using the legislative process, and then they also do voter engagement as well. So ISPU's data was used by Emgage. It was the basis by which Emgage grew, and now our biggest chapter is actually in Michigan. Our first successful election was, we supported El Sayed. We supported Rashida Tlaib on the Emgage Action side, which is the endorsement process. Ibrahim Ayash also supported numerous other candidates throughout the years. And then one of the goals of Emgage, based on ISP data, was to try to get 1 million Muslims to vote. And on the last election, Emgage, part of other groups, ICNA, MPAC, other groups were able to get 1 million Muslims to vote. We work with a thing called a VAN database, and we could give that information back to officials, and they can vet that themselves. Now, right now, we are very Democratic leaning. It's hard to engage Republicans right now, but we're also quite aware that that cycle will change. And we're hoping that some of you will be interested in engaging Republicans without hating yourself. Emgage also worked with ISP and other groups to develop the White House process. At this point, the American Muslim community has 8 Senate and 1 coming Senate verified and vetted cabinet positions, sub-cabinet positions. The most we ever had was 2. So these are just some of the impacts of how when people organize groups, they can have an impact way outside of our profession. So I want to share some of these ideas with you and to talk about ISPU and its impact. إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله ما لنا